It was a gray, restless morning as clouds rolled across the sky like heavy curtains preparing to unleash a storm. Outside the city courthouse, a quiet crowd gathered, their voices low and anxious, each face etched with the silent plea for justice long denied. They had come not just for a verdict, but for something deeper, hope that the system which had failed them time and time again might, for once, choose truth. Inside the courtroom, the air was tense, thick with anticipation and the weight of countless disappointments. All eyes were fixed on the judge as silence gripped the room like a clenched fist. Then, the gavel struck, sharp and final, dismissing the charges yet again. It was like a punch to the soul. A wave of cruel, arrogant laughter followed, slicing through the air like a blade. The sound didn't just mock the courtroom, it mocked every person who had ever believed in fairness. The wooden doors swung open and three officers, Mike Reynolds, Greg Carter, and Tom Willis, emerged with smug triumph painted across their faces. Mike, broad-shouldered and defiant, led the way with a proud strut, chin lifted high like a man untouchable by consequence. Greg followed, tall and lean, his smirk casual, as if this moment was just another easy win in a game he never expected to lose. Tom, shorter but equally self-assured, carried a cocky grin, his eyes flickering with unrepentant glee. Mike nudged Greg, laughter laced with contempt bubbling under his breath. "Told you we had nothing to worry about. It's always the same, they never have enough evidence." Greg chuckled in return, eyes scanning the courtroom with bored amusement. Did they really think this time would be different? Their arrogance was a sickness, a virus that had infected the very heart of justice. Behind them, Tom glanced around the room, and for a fleeting second, his smile wavered. He caught the eyes of onlookers, eyes not filled with admiration, but with quiet fury and helplessness. He quickly shrugged it off, adjusting his uniform like armor, a reminder to everyone present of who still held the power. But they didn't see her, at least, not yet. In the back corner, seated alone, an elderly African-American woman watched him intently, unmoving. Her eyes didn't blink, they pierced through the charade like sunlight through a lie. Her face bore the weight of years of loss, pain, and waiting, but her eyes still burned with quiet fire. In her hand, she clutched a small, worn photograph, her son, forever young in the frame. A life stolen by the very men now celebrating. She had hoped for justice today. Again, it had slipped through her fingers like dust. But something was different this time. As she watched their backs retreat, laughing and proud, her jaw clenched, not with despair, but with new resolve. Mike felt it first, an unexplainable chill crawling up his spine. He turned briefly and met her eyes. For one heartbeat, something inside him faltered. He knew those eyes, he knew that pain, it echoed a truth he had buried long ago. But pride quickly overtook the flicker of recognition, and he turned away, brushing it off with a snide comment to Greg and Tom. The woman exhaled slowly, whispering beneath her breath, "Enjoy your moment, justice may be slow, but it always finds its way." The officers, blinded by arrogance, stepped out into the chaos of flashing cameras and clamoring reporters, unaware that the storm they thought they had outrun was only just beginning. Mike nudged Greg playfully, a low chuckle escaping his throat, his voice laced with contempt as he whispered, "Told you we had nothing to worry about, it's always the same story." Greg grinned and shook his head, that smug, careless smile dancing on his lips as he muttered, "Did they really think things would change this time?" Their arrogance was thick, reeking of men too long untouched by consequence. Behind them, Tom glanced around the room, and for a brief second, a shadow flickered across his face. He caught the stares, those piercing eyes of the people in the gallery, not filled with admiration, but with something much colder, resentment, rage, and powerlessness. Tom's grin faltered ever so slightly, but he quickly shrugged it off, tugging at his uniform like a shield, as if to remind himself, and everyone else, who still held the reins of power. And yet, beyond the applause of their loyal supporters and the oppressive silence of those too afraid to speak, someone, watched. In a quiet, shadowed corner of the courtroom, an elderly black woman sat, unmoving, her posture straight, her hands folded gently in her lap, her eyes locked with fierce intensity on the trio. No tears, no visible anger, just a storm of fire in her gaze. Burning with the weight of decades spent waiting, enduring, surviving, her face, worn and lined, spoke of pain that ran deep, more than this trial, more than today. Clutched in her weathered palm was a small photograph, its edges faded and soft from time, a young man's smile forever frozen in innocence. He was her son, lost not to time, not to illness or war, but to the very men now parading themselves in victory. Today, she had dared to hope. She had risen before the sun, dressed carefully, walked into this courtroom carrying not just grief but a fragile sliver of belief that justice might finally whisper her name. But once again, the system had spoken with cold indifference. Her boy's name remained buried beneath paperwork and silence. His story denied breath once more. Still, she did not cry. She didn't flinch. Instead, her fingers curled tighter around the photo. And something inside her, something ancient and unbreakable, hardened. She would not look away. As Mike laughed, a strange feeling stirred in the pit of his stomach. A chill, subtle but undeniable, crept along his spine. He turned slightly, almost instinctively, and there, her eyes. He froze, only for a heartbeat, but in that fleeting second, his cocky mask cracked. He knew those eyes. They haunted some deep corner of his mind, a buried memory struggling to resurface. It was the face of consequence, the mirror of a truth he had long refused to acknowledge. But pride is a dangerous armor, and Mike wore it well. He forced a scoff, turned sharply, muttering to Greg and Tom, urging them toward the exit. Behind them, the woman let out a breath, not of exhaustion, but of certainty. Her voice, barely a whisper, carried through the courtroom like a promise carved into stone. Enjoy your moment. Justice may be slow, but it always finds its way. Outside, the doors opened to the blinding flashes of cameras, the chaotic dance of reporters and their relentless questions, thunder rumbling faintly in the distance as if the sky itself was warning what was to come. And inside, that lone woman stood, slowly, carefully, clutching her son's memory to her chest, her back straight, her eyes unyielding, her heart steady. She was not defeated, not today, not anymore, because something had shifted. The victory that belonged to corruption this morning would belong to truth tomorrow. And truth, as history has shown, is a force no lie can bury forever. Years before the injustice that played out in the courtroom, before the system crushed his dreams and stole his uniform, Jamal Brooks had once stood proud beneath the rising sun, his police badge gleaming like a symbol of hope, his heart full of conviction. He had joined the force not out of naivety, but out of belief that change could come from within, that justice was not just an idea but a responsibility. Fresh-faced and driven, he walked into the precinct with determination in his step and fairness in his blood. But it didn't take long for the cracks in the system to reveal themselves. The patterns were subtle at first, but they were there. Too many stops in the same neighborhoods. Too many reports dismissed. Too many eyes looking away. Mike Reynolds, Greg Carter, and Tom Willis, seasoned officers who carried power like a weapon, quickly revealed their true colors. Jamal saw them lean on their badges to harass, to intimidate, to twist the law into something cruel and self-serving. Black men were their targets of choice. Complaints disappeared, video evidence mysteriously corrupted, and the few brave souls who dared to speak up were silenced by threats, fear, and the heavy machinery of a corrupt system. Jamal felt each injustice like a stone in his chest, piling higher every day, until one night, it came crashing down. He wasn't looking to catch them, but fate placed him there. Late one evening, he turned the corner behind the station and saw the truth unfolding like a nightmare. Mike and Tom were bent over a car, planting evidence, their movements quick and practiced. Greg leaned casually against the patrol vehicle nearby, watching with smug satisfaction. Jamal froze. His blood ran cold, his heart pounded in his ears. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, voice tight with rage and disbelief. Mike looked up sharply, his expression snapping from surprise to contempt. "This doesn't concern you, rookie," he sneered, eyes narrowing like a predator sizing up its prey. "Turn around and walk away." But Jamal didn't move. He stepped closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "I can't do that," he said, voice low and steady. "This stops right here, right now." Greg laughed, stepping forward, his shadow falling over Jamal. "You really think you're going to change anything, Brooks?" he asked coldly. "Who's going to believe you?" Jamal stood his ground. His voice didn't shake. "They'll believe the truth." Tom came up behind him, voice low and dangerous. "Careful, Brooks. You sure you want to pick this fight?" But it wasn't a choice anymore. Jamal had already crossed the line the moment he opened his mouth. There was no going back. Everything his parents had taught him, every value he held, every reason he joined the force in the first place, it all converged into this one moment of terrifying clarity. He would not look away. Not now. Not ever. Days after that fateful confrontation, Jamal Brooks was summoned to the captain's office. The tension already coiled tight in his chest like a spring ready to snap. He walked in with shoulders straight. But the moment he crossed the threshold, he felt the air shift, thick, heavy, suffocating. Mike, Greg, and Tom were already there, standing near the captain's desk, their faces painted with smug victory. It was a trap, and he knew it the second Captain Harris, a man who once shook Jamal's hand and called him one of the good ones, looked away in shame as he delivered the words that shattered everything. Jamal was under investigation for misconduct, corruption, and obstruction of justice. The irony sliced like glass. They had taken his truth and twisted it into a weapon, forged lies with the same cold efficiency they had used against the people they were sworn to protect. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come, not because he was afraid, but because he knew it didn't matter. The decision had already been made. They had planned this. Jamal saw it in their eyes, Mike's gloating, Greg's quiet smirk, Tom's smug satisfaction. They had orchestrated every step, planted every lie, and the system they thrived in had embraced it like gospel. Anger surged within him, hot and suffocating, but beneath that fury was something even heavier, a deep, sorrowful ache. This wasn't just about losing a job. It was the death of a dream, of a belief that one man could stand against a corrupt machine and make it move. That night, as Jamal packed up his belongings in silence, the clang of metal lockers and distant chatter ringing hollow in his ears, a quiet voice pulled him from his thoughts. Sarah, young, uncertain, and visibly shaken, approached him with eyes full of regret and helplessness. "I saw everything," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I wish I could have helped. I'm so sorry." Jamal looked at her, offering the kindest smile he could muster, even as grief threatened to swallow him whole. "Don't be," he said gently, "just don't forget who you are. Even when they try to make you forget, promise me, you'll keep fighting, no matter how lonely it gets." Tears slid silently down her cheeks as she nodded. "I promise." Carrying the small cardboard box that held the last remnants of his time in the force, his dream reduced to a few folders, a mug, a photo, Jamal walked out of the precinct for the last time. The building that once symbolized purpose now loomed behind him like a monument to betrayal. He paused for a moment, eyes lifting toward the tattered American flag swaying in the evening breeze, its colors dulled by years of sun and storm. He took a slow, steady breath, one that carried with it the weight of heartbreak, the sting of injustice, and the quiet promise of unfinished business. He whispered to himself, not as a broken man, but as one reborn in resolve. "One day, I'll be back, and the truth will finally be heard." And though he didn't yet know how or when, Jamal felt something stir in that twilight silence, the beginning of a storm long overdue. Years passed, but the memory of that betrayal never left Jamal Brooks. It lived in his bones, in every breath, in the echo of every silence that followed the promise he had once made outside that precinct door. Then one morning, fate knocked gently, dressed not in justice's armor, but in Opportunity's quiet clothing. The City Hall conference room was bathed in warm sunlight, casting golden lines across the anxious faces that filled the space, reporters leaning forward. Microphones poised, cameras blinking in anticipation. Police officers lined the back wall, arms crossed, eyes skeptical, some curious, some indifferent. Among them stood Mike Reynolds, Greg Carter, and Tom Willis, still cocky, still comfortably ensconced in the power they'd never truly earned. Mike leaned against the wall, his smirk lazy, whispering sarcasm to Greg and Tom. "Here we go again, same speech. Different mayor." The atmosphere was thick with indifference until Mayor Eleanor Mitchell stepped forward to the podium. Her presence was calm but commanding, her voice steady, slicing through the murmurs like the first drop of rain before a storm. "Our city," she began, "has allowed corruption, mistrust, and injustice to fester for far too long. That ends today." Mike rolled his eyes, dismissing her words like the dozens of empty promises they'd heard before. But then she paused, letting the weight of her next words hang in the air. "To fix what's broken, we need someone who knows pain. Someone who knows what it means to be betrayed by the very system they believed in. We need someone who embodies true justice." As she spoke, the double doors at the back of the room opened slowly, and time seemed to freeze. In stepped Jamal Brooks, dressed not in the shame of a man once cast out, but in the honor of one who had risen again, his uniform immaculate, his posture strong, his eyes unshaken. He walked with quiet authority, each step echoing louder than 1,000 accusations. The room fell utterly silent. Breaths caught midair, eyes wide in disbelief. Mike's smirk vanished in an instant, replaced by a pale flicker of shock. Greg stood frozen, unable to blink. Tom's jaw clenched, his skin draining of color as if he was staring at a ghost that had come back not just to haunt, but to lead. Mayor Mitchell's voice rang out once more, unwavering and clear. "It is my great honor to introduce the new chief of police, Jamal Brooks." The name struck like thunder. The room erupted into stunned murmurs, gasps, and the flurry of flashbulbs. But Jamal didn't flinch. His eyes locked briefly with Mike's, not in vengeance, but in quiet reckoning. In that glance, he didn't need to speak. The message was already clear. "I told you I'd be back." Mike looked away sharply, jaw tight, swallowing the fear he'd never admit. The game had changed, and they were no longer holding the cards. After the applause had quieted and the cameras turned away, Jamal Brooks found himself standing in Mayor Eleanor Mitchell's quiet, wood-paneled office, a place that felt both solemn and symbolic, like the calm eye of a storm that had only just begun to swirl. The mayor looked at him with eyes that held both respect and an unspoken weight. Her voice softer now but no less resolute. "Jamal," she said, "I chose you because this city doesn't need a politician in uniform. It needs someone who has felt the sting of betrayal, who understands what injustice looks like from the inside out. You've lived it. Now you have the clarity and strength to dismantle it." Jamal nodded slowly, his mind already racing through the scale of what lay ahead. "I appreciate your faith in me, Mayor," he replied, his voice low and thoughtful. "But I won't pretend this is going to be easy. The truth is, many people in that department won't welcome what I represent." She gave him a quiet smile, not of dismissal, but of understanding. "That's exactly why it must be you," she said gently. "This department doesn't need comfort, it needs courage. And I know you have it." Later, as Jamal walked the familiar halls of the precinct, not as a rookie, not as a scapegoat, but as the new chief, his footsteps echoed against the walls like the steady beat of a war drum. He could feel the stares, some cautious, others curious, a few openly skeptical, but among the sea of guarded glances were also eyes that flickered with something else, hope. Officers who had long grown weary of the rot within, who had watched good people leave or stay silent. Jamal nodded politely as he passed them, but his heart beat harder when he neared the desk where his career had once been shattered. It stood empty now, cleared and waiting, but the memories hung in the air like ghosts, whispers of whispered threats. The gut punch of betrayal, The quiet collapse of dreams that once lived there. He paused, his hand brushing over the desk's surface. And in that stillness, the pain returned, not to haunt him but to harden him. This was no longer about revenge, this was about restoration. The fight was never just his. It belonged to every officer who had dared to speak but was silenced. To every citizen who was brutalized and ignored. To every mother who sat in a courtroom clutching a photograph and hoping for justice. He turned toward his new office. His new beginning. And that's when he saw her. Sarah, no longer the timid recruit whose voice trembled with apology. But a woman who had grown through fire. Her eyes met his, strong and unwavering, and in that look was a silent promise remembered. A vow that had lived quietly in the shadows of time. She nodded once, not needing words, and Jamal nodded back. Together, without saying a thing, they acknowledged the path behind them and the one they were now destined to walk together. When he closed the door to his office behind him, the weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like armor, heavy but fitting. For the first time in years, his spirit felt light, not because the battle was over, but because he was no longer standing outside the fight, he was leading it. He understood the dangers that lay ahead. He knew the resistance would be fierce, the sabotage clever, the enemies desperate, but what they didn't understand, what they had never understood, was that Jamal Brooks was no longer just a man with a badge. He was a symbol, a reckoning, a reminder that truth, once buried, always claws its way back to the surface. And now, with authority in his hands and a fire in his soul, Jamal was ready to burn down the walls that had protected corruption for far too long. From the moment Jamal Brooks stepped into his role as chief of police, the battle began, not with shouting or headlines, but in silence, in shadows, in the quiet, calculated resistance of a system that didn't want to change. He didn't make grand speeches or seek revenge. Instead, he went to work with precision and quiet fire, launching an internal investigation that reached back through years of buried files, missing reports, and half-written complaints. Each document he uncovered felt like a whisper from the past begging to be heard. He spent nights poring over personnel files and rereading case after case that had long been dismissed or forgotten. But at every step forward, something pushed back. Documents vanished overnight. Footage that had existed only hours earlier became corrupted. Key pieces of evidence mysteriously went missing. Witnesses who had once been eager to speak now avoided his calls, their eyes darting with fear, their voices trembling with apologies they couldn't explain. Jamal felt it all around him, a presence, a pressure, an invisible web of silence and threat. He knew who was behind it. He didn't need confessions or signatures to know that Mike, Greg, and Tom were pulling strings behind the scenes, desperate to protect the rotten foundation they had built their careers on. But knowing and proving were two very different things, and Jamal felt the frustration mount like a wave pressing hard against a fragile dam. Alone in his office late one evening, he rubbed his temples, exhaustion weighing heavy in his bones. The walls around him felt closer than they had before, the silence louder, the shadows darker. He knew he was fighting ghosts, men who still wore uniforms by day and masks by night. Men who had grown used to power without accountability. And just when he began to wonder how much longer he could keep pushing against the invisible walls, the phone rang. The voice on the other end was soft but steady. "Chief Brooks?" it asked. He recognized it instantly. It was the elderly woman from the courtroom, the one whose eyes had once locked with his, who had whispered a promise into the void as her enemies laughed. "My name is Evelyn Carter," she said, her tone filled with quiet strength. "My son Marcus, he was taken from me because of Mike Reynolds and his friends." Jamal sat up straighter, the haze of fatigue disappearing instantly. "I remember you, Mrs. Carter," he said. "Do you have information?" Her reply was calm, but powerful. "I have something better," she said. "I have a video. I've kept it hidden for years. It shows everything, how they planted evidence, how they brutalized my boy. I was afraid, too afraid to show anyone. But I trust you." Jamal felt something shift inside him. A surge of hope so fierce it almost brought tears to his eyes. After all the closed doors and corrupted files, here was truth, raw and undeniable, calling him out of the darkness. "Thank you," he whispered. "Let's meet tomorrow. I promise. I'll keep you safe." And for the first time in weeks, as he hung up the phone, he allowed himself to breathe, not in relief, but in resolve. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for certain: the tide was beginning to turn.